He was just 22 years old, athletic, handsome, a brilliant engineer and rower from Oxford University, and by June of 1924, he would become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries on Earth. His name was Andrew Sandy Irvine, and he vanished somewhere near the summit of Mount Everest, alongside veteran climber George Mallory. But this is not just a story of ambition lost to the snow. It is a story of obsession, controversy, and a fallout that echoes nearly a century later. Back in the early 1920s, the British Empire was still reeling from World War I. The war had gutted a generation. Sons, brothers, fathers gone. The nation yearned for a symbol of greatness, something heroic to reclaim its spirit. Mount Everest, the tallest mountain in the world, became that symbol. Remote, untamed, and deadly. A place where honor could be regained, and perhaps immortality earned. The Royal Geographical Society and Alpine Club had already sent 2 expeditions to Everest. Both failed, but in 1924, a third expedition was approved. Its leader, General Charles Bruce, its most celebrated member, George Mallory, 37-year-old schoolteacher who had tried and failed twice before. His mantra, because it's there. But then came Sandy Irvine. No one expected him to be on the expedition. He wasn't a mountaineer by pedigree. He had never been higher than a few Welsh peaks. But Irvine had something the others didn't: engineering brilliance. He could strip down a primitive oxygen set and rebuild it in an afternoon. He designed lightweight frames, improved valves, and carried himself with a kind of golden boy aura that made others follow him without question. Mallory noticed him immediately. There's no definitive record of their first long conversation, but it's widely believed that during a training climb in Snowdonia, Mallory watched Irvine scale a jagged ridgeline with speed and confidence. By the time the expedition ship SS California left Liverpool for India, Sandy Irvine had joined the core climbing team, though many in the mountaineering establishment were baffled by his inclusion. The expedition crossed oceans, then rails, and finally yaks and boots into the Himalayas. The route was long and grueling, passing through Sikkim and then into Tibet, toward the northern face of Everest, a remote flank, far from the crowded tourist paths of today. In those days, the south route through Nepal was closed to outsiders. Everest in 1924 was a different world. No base camp, no GPS, no satellite phones or Gore-Tex suits, just wool, leather, and guesswork. The team reached the Rongbuk Glacier in late April and began climatizing at over 17,000 feet. It was here that the camp split into 2 mindsets: those who trusted old-school climbing instincts, and those, like Mallory and Irvine, who now believed supplemental oxygen was the future of high-altitude success. Irvine made himself indispensable. He repaired broken tents, oxygen sets, stoves. His camaraderie and work ethic were contagious. Too many, he represented a new generation of climatechnical, disciplined, and unafraid of risk. But for all his skills, he had a fatal flaw: inexperience, and that would become dangerously important. By late May, 2 summit attempts had already failed. Mallory was under pressure from his sponsors, from his legacy, and from his own ego. He needed a final push, and when it came time to choose a partner, he surprised everyone. He bypassed the veteran climber Noel Odell and chose Sandy Irvine. It was a decision that would ignite debate for decades. On June 6, 1924, George Mallory and Sandy Irvine left camp for at 26,800 feet. Their plan was simple: climb to the summit using oxygen, then descend before nightfall. They were last seen the next day, June 8, by Noel Odell through a clearing in the clouds just below, a feature known as the second step, tantalizingly close to the summit. And then, they were gone. For 75 years, no one knew what happened. Some believed they reached the summit and died on the way down. Others argued they never made it at all. The controversy divided historians and mountaineers alike. And at the center of that mystery stood Sandy Irvine, whose young face remained frozen in time, chronicled in black and white photos. His story suspended in the high-altitude wind. But what came next, the search, the fallout, and the strange clues left behind would turn this tragedy into one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. For 2 full days after Mallory and Irvine vanished into the mist above 28,000 feet, the mountain was silent. The wind howled, the weather turned, and no figures reappeared. Back at Camp 4, Noel Odell waited, scanning the ridgeline every few hours, willing some movement, but there was nothing. On June 10, 1924, the decision was made. The final camp was abandoned, and the expedition began its long, sorrowful descent down the mountain. By the time they returned to Britain weeks later, the headlines had already been written: Mallory and Irvine missing on Everest, presumed dead. But that wasn't the end. Instead, their disappearance sparked a national hysteria and a global obsession that would stretch across generations. At first, Mallory took the spotlight. He was the romantic figure, the seasoned climber, the embodiment of Edwardian heroism. Newspapers published his old letters. His quote, "Because it's there," was elevated to myth. In London, a memorial service at St. Paul's Cathedral drew thousands. But Sandy Irvine, he was harder to define. Younger, less known, more of a supporting character in the grand narrative. And yet, for many, that made him even more compelling. Who was this boy who had marched so confidently to the roof of the world and never returned? In private, the expedition's surviving members debated fiercely about what had gone wrong. Some, like Odell, believed Mallory and Irvine had come incredibly close to the summit, perhaps even reaching it. In a memoir, Odell recalled seeing them nearing the base of the final pyramid before clouds obscured the view. That phrase would haunt Everest historians for nearly a century. Others were more skeptical. They pointed to Irvine's lack of climbing experience, the technical challenges of the second stepper near vertical 30-foot cliff, and the primitive state of their equipment. But one fact complicated everything. If Mallory and Irvine had reached the summit in 1924, they would have beaten Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary by 29 years. That possibility turned their disappearance into more than tragedy. It became a controversial question of legacy, and it ignited a movement to find proof. By the 1930s, multiple British expeditions returned to Everest, not just to summit, but to search. Letters, cameras, bones, any sign that might reveal the truth. And central to those hopes was one object: Sandy Irvine's Kodak Vest pocket camera. The theory went like this: if they'd summited, they likely photographed it. And if the camera could be found, and the film developed even decades later, it might solve the mystery. It became an almost mythical relic, a small metal box lost in the snow, possibly holding the answer to one of mountaineering's greatest questions. Years passed, then decades, and the trail went cold, until 1999. That year, an expedition funded by the Mallory and Irvine Research Project, led by climber Conrad Anker, made a shocking discovery on the north face of Everest. While searching near the fall line, below the second step, they spotted something strange in the scree: a body. The corpse was astonishingly well preserved, face down, arms outstretched, dressed in 1920s clothing, and the skin on the back was still intact, bleached white by decades of snow and ice. When they rolled him over, they found an old altimeter, broken goggles in his pocket, and a name tag. It was George Mallory. The world gasped. After 75 years, the mystery had cracked open, but not yet solved. Mallory's body was found lower than expected, suggesting a fall. His injuries indicated he had survived the initial impact. There was rope trauma around his waist, raising the possibility that the two climbers had been roped together when they fell. But there was no camera, no Irvine. And that absence again shifted the spotlight back to Sandy. So where was he? Many theorized that Irvine's body and the camera lay higher up, closer to the second step. The terrain is brutally steep there, jagged and exposed. Avalanches, rock slides, and time may have buried him beyond recovery. Yet others believe Irvine may still be visible, hidden in plain sight, caught in a crevasse, or pinned behind a rock. Several satellite scans and drone flights have been conducted in the area, but weather and permissions from the Chinese government have repeatedly delayed thorough ground searches. Even more mysterious are the unconfirmed sightings. Over the years, several climbers have reported seeing a body in a yellow anorak higher up the mountain matching Irvine's known clothing. One Chinese climber in 1975 claimed to have stumbled upon a frozen corpse and a camera near the ridge, but the details are vague, and the climber later died in an avalanche. And so the camera, the holy grail of Everest archaeology, missing. But even without the camera, Sandy Irvine's story endures. Because it's not just about whether he reached the top, it's about why he went, and what he represents. To some, he was a victim of Mallory's ambition. To others, a symbol of courage, a boy who, at 22, dared to do what few ever attempt. But the story doesn't end in legend alone. because the fallout from 1924 would shape the way the world approached Everest forever. Next, we explore how one vanished climber helped inspire the very future of high-altitude mountaineering, how the ghosts of Everest still pull people back to that icy ridge, year after year. In the years after the disappearance of Sandy Irvine and George Mallory, Everest stopped being just a mountain. It became a mythological proving ground, a place where the line between triumph and tragedy blurred beneath layers of ice and ambition. The 1924 expedition failed to return its climbers. It succeeded in something else, creating the legend of Everest. For decades, the question wasn't just who could climb it. It was, did Mallory and Irvine already do it? The fallout from their disappearance ran deep. Back in Britain, the Alpine Club closed ranks. Publicly, they celebrated the courage of the 1924 team. Privately, many questioned whether Mallory's decision to take Irvine so young, so inexperienced, was reckless. Some whispered that Sandy's inclusion had been political, even sentimental. That Mallory, aging and aware this might be his final chance at glory, chose a companion who wouldn't challenge his authority or slow him with debate. But the truth, as always, is more complicated. Irvine had earned his place. By the time the team set foot on the mountain, he had become indispensable, modifying oxygen equipment that everyone else struggled to operate. Even veteran climbers relied on him for repairs. Mallory likely saw Irvine not only as a loyal partner, but as their best chance to summit with supplemental oxygen, which was still a controversial and misunderstood method at the time. Nevertheless, their deaths would cast a long shadow over future climbs. It would be 29 years before anyone else would stand atop Everest. In 1953, Edmund Hillary of New Zealand and Tenzing Norgay, the famed Sherpa from Nepal, succeeded where all others had failed. They reached the summit from the southern route choosing oxygen and returned alive. It was a landmark moment, and for most of the world, it ended the question. Hillary and Tenzing were the first, but not everyone was satisfied. For many in the British climbing community, the mystery of 1924 still gnawed at the edges of history. Could Mallory and Irvine have reached the top before succumbing on the way down? The discovery of Mallory's body in 1999 only deepened the fascination. His position on the slope, his injuries, and the missing camera all pointed to a descent in progress, possibly after a summit attempt. Yet, with Sandy Irvine still missing, the evidence was incomplete. Climbing technology had changed dramatically. Since 1924, so had ethics. But one thing remained: the reverence for Everest's dead. Many of the bodies on Everest are still visible today, frozen in time, untouched out of respect or necessity, and among all those figures, none is searched for more than Irvine. In 2019, another high-profile expedition tried to locate his body. Led by climber Mark Sinat and photographer Renan Osterk, the team had obtained rare permission from the Chinese government to explore the exact area where Irvine might be. They climbed high. They searched the terrain where rumors said his body had once been seen. They used drones, radar, infrared, but they found nothing. Still, the legend persists, because Sandy Irvine isn't just a man lost on a mountain. He's a symbol of youthful ambition, of unanswered questions, and of the thin line between glory and grief. Every year, climbers from around the world ascend Everest, hoping to survive the summit. But some also carry a quieter goal: to find Irvine, to finish a story frozen in time, because until that camera is found, the mountain still holds its secret. Today, nearly a century after that fateful climb, the story of Sandy Irvine continues to echo through the snowfields and icefalls of Everest, not just as a mystery, but as a mirror reflecting the values and evolution of mountaineering itself. In 1924, Everest was considered unclimbable by many. The Himalayas were remote, dangerous, and sacred to the people who lived in their shadows. When Mallory and Irvine disappeared, Everest became not just a challenge, it became a shrine, a white cathedral where ambition and mortality would forever be linked. But after 1953, everything changed. With the successful ascent by Hillary and Tenzing, Everest was conquered, at least in the popular imagination. By the 1970s and 80s, dozens of climbers were attempting the peak each season. Today, in some years, hundreds of people crowd the narrow summit ridge during a short weather window, clogging the same passages that once claimed the lives of legends. Oxygen is no longer controversial, it's standard. So are GPS, satellite, phones, weather forecasts, and synthetic clothing. What Sandy Irvine once attempted in leather boots and wool trousers is now done in high-tech suits costing tens of thousands of dollars. And yet the danger remains, and so does the question. Every few years, another team heads to Everest with one goal: to find Irvine. They search the same ridges, the same gullies, hoping for a glimpse of faded clothing or the glint of an old metal camera. In their minds, they're not just solving a mystery, they're preserving a legacy. But what would it really mean if the camera were found? If the film were recoverable? And that's a big if. It could prove that Mallory and Irvine reached the summit in 1924. It would rewrite history, move the timeline of human conquest on Everest back by nearly 3 decades. But more than that, it would give closure. It would transform Irvine from a question mark into a definitive part of mountaineering's most sacred story. Still, others argue that it doesn't matter, because Irvine's greatness isn't defined by whether he stood on the top of the world. It's defined by his courage to try at, just 22 years old, what almost no one had dared: to walk into thin air, tethered to history, armed with little more than belief. For his family, the loss was lifelong. Letters stopped arriving. His name was chiseled onto plaques and gravestones, but no body was ever returned. And unlike Mallory, whose remains were recovered, Sandy Irvine still sleeps somewhere on the high slopes, where the wind never stops. In a way, he has become Everest itself, remote, enigmatic, unreachable. And perhaps that's why the story endures. Because some mysteries shouldn't be solved too easily. Because some legends live not in answers, but in the questions they leave behind. Sandy Irvine's story isn't over. Not as long as people keep climbing. Not as long as the summit still calls. Not as long as there's one more storm, one more step, one more man willing to chase the top of the world. Even now, the mountain waits. And somewhere up there, Irvine does too.